Something remarkable happened in Canada's automotive market this year that barely registered in American business coverage. The market share of US manufactured passenger vehicles in Canada has dropped to approximately 36%, a historic low. Canada is one of the United States' largest customers for automobiles. Historically, it purchased the majority of its vehicles from American factories. That relationship is changing in real time, driven not by government policy alone, but by a nationwide consumer shift that is accelerating with each passing month. The mechanics of the shift are straightforward and the data supports it. Canada is a net importer of vehicles. The country buys significantly more vehicles from other countries than it sells abroad. That structural reality means Canadians have substantial purchasing power that can be redirected. When the United States imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian manufactured automobiles under the Section 232 framework, Canadians responded by examining their own purchasing choices. The result is the market share collapse now documented in Canada's import data. Understanding which vehicles are actually manufactured in Canada requires one specific piece of information. The vehicle identification number carries the answer in its first digit. A VIN starting with the number 2 means the vehicle was built in Canada. A VIN starting with 1, 4, or 5 indicates American manufacture. A 3 indicates Mexico. That single character determines whether a Canadian car purchase supports Canadian manufacturing, employment, or foreign production. The vehicles assembled in Canada span a range of popular segments. Toyota builds the RAV4 in Cambridge and Woodstock, Ontario. Lexus produces the RX and NX models in Cambridge. Honda manufactures the Civic and CR-V in Alliston, Ontario. General Motors assembles the Chevrolet Silverado and GMC Sierra in Oshawa. Stellantis builds the Chrysler Pacifica, Chrysler Voyager, Grand Caravan, and Dodge Charger Daytona in Windsor. These are not obscure models. They are among the top-selling vehicles in Canada's market, representing the crossover, pickup, and van segments that dominate Canadian consumer purchases. The U.S. automotive trade position reveals why Washington targeted Canada specifically. In 2024, the United States imported $391 billion worth of automobiles and automotive parts, while exporting $144 billion, a deficit of approximately $247 billion on automotive trade alone. Canada was the #1 source of American automotive imports, supplying approximately $58 billion worth annually. Almost all of Canada's $58 billion in automotive exports went directly to the United States. And almost all of Canada's $90 billion in automotive imports came from the United States. The two countries functioned as each other's primary automotive trading partners in a near-exclusive bilateral relationship. Washington's calculation was that imposing tariffs on Canadian vehicles would reduce American import volumes, shrink the trade deficit, and push production from Canadian factories into American facilities. The assumption embedded in that calculation was that Canadian consumers would continue purchasing American-built vehicles regardless of what Washington did to the Canadian automotive industry. That assumption appears to be incorrect. The precedent for what is now happening in automobiles had already been established in 2 other consumer categories. When Canada applied retaliatory measures during the trade conflict, Canadian consumers stopped purchasing American wines and spirits. Canadian wine and spirits producers had their best year on record as domestic alternatives captured the market share that American products vacated. Canadian domestic tourism followed the same pattern. Canadians who previously took holidays in American destinations redirected that spending toward Canadian destinations, producing the strongest domestic tourism numbers in the industry's modern history. Both industries benefited directly from a consumer behavior shift that was driven by principle and sustained by habit. The automobile sector is a larger and more structurally significant industry than wine and spirits or tourism. Canada's automotive manufacturing employs tens of thousands of workers directly, with an estimated 125,000 jobs across the full supply chain, including parts manufacturers, logistics companies, and dealership networks. Those jobs are concentrated in Ontario communities, Windsor, Oshawa, Cambridge, Woodstock, Alliston, whose economic foundations are built around automotive production. When American tariffs reduced the competitiveness of Canadian-assembled vehicles in American markets, those communities absorbed the production cuts directly. Canadian auto plants are currently building approximately 30% fewer vehicles than they were in the prior year. That production decline is a documented consequence of the American tariff policy. The customer review that reaches its July 1st deadline adds another dimension to the automotive trade story. The American negotiating position presented to Canada and Mexico on May 29th demands that vehicles contain at least 82.5% North American content, up from the current 75%, and that at least 50% of a vehicle's total content must be produced specifically in the United States. That country-specific content floor is the most commercially disruptive element of the American proposal, because the current framework measures North American content cumulatively. A part manufactured in Ontario contributes equally to the regional content calculation as a part manufactured in Ohio. The proposed 50% US-specific threshold would break that equivalence and effectively penalize Canadian-assembled content relative to American-assembled content in the same vehicle. For Canadian consumers making vehicle purchasing decisions right now, the customer negotiating context reinforces the same conclusion that the existing tariff situation has already established. The United States government is actively pursuing automotive trade policy that is designed to reduce the commercial viability of Canadian auto manufacturing. Purchasing a vehicle with a VIN number starting with 2 is the most direct individual response available to that policy direction. It is not a protest. It is an economic allocation decision with measurable consequences for Canadian employment and manufacturing output. The country-level automotive trade balance makes the logic of the Canadian consumer response visible in numerical terms. Germany, China, Japan, South Korea, Mexico, and Spain all hold positive automotive trade balances. They manufacture more vehicles than they consume domestically and export the surplus to global markets. The United States and Canada are both net automotive importers who primarily sell vehicles to each other across a shared border. That mutual dependence is precisely why American tariff pressure on Canadian automotive exports is a policy that damages American manufacturers alongside Canadian ones. The supply chains are integrated, the markets are interconnected, and the components cross the border multiple times before a finished vehicle is assembled. The Anderson Economic Group estimated that American tariffs have already raised auto costs in the North American market by more than $100 billion. Those costs are distributed across manufacturers, suppliers, and ultimately consumers on both sides of the border. Every vehicle assembled in Windsor or Oshawa or Cambridge that a Canadian consumer chooses over an American-assembled alternative is a unit of purchasing power retained within Canada's manufacturing ecosystem rather than transferred to the country that is applying commercial pressure to reduce that ecosystem's viability. The market share of American-manufactured vehicles in Canada has reached its historic low at approximately 36%. The decline is documented and continuing. Canadian wine and spirits producers had their best year on record. Canadian tourism had its strongest year on record. Both outcomes followed from Canadian consumers redirecting spending away from American products and toward Canadian alternatives.